not too mean.
Whose career are you going to destroy? You are
No.
like a graduate student with all these notes.
With all the academics. And I'm the one non-academic. So you'll be fine. Don't worry. You'll be.
We'll survive.
You'll survive. You may have some new ideas to put in the next article.
I have already spent my
Oh, really?
weapons.
No. There's always something more.
You know my tricks.
There's always something more to be said. No, the notes are necessary in some ways because everyone has a slightly different area of focus. So if you just don't interlink them in some way, then you're going to have very disparate things, and obviously that's not necessarily very helpful.
So are you going to ask
So part of it is
different questions about the same issue?
no, different questions, because its point is to try to bring out some of the arguments and issues. And for example, I'm not going to ask you to speak about exactly the same thing about, for example, how roads affect ethnic federalism, because what do you know about that? I mean, maybe you have an opinion, but it's not something necessarily where you should be the lead respondent to that. So it's a bit like
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I read some of Daniel's articles.
It's different, right? Because it's from a very ethnographic or anthropological point of view.
I was
as political scientists, we don't sort of go there.
I was like saying, I mean, if you want to understand what's going on, the dynamics, that's what's the approach. To look at the use and what's driving the drivers. So use and employment is important. Industry, I really like.
But it's also something that you can interrogate later, because, for example, one of the things I was asking about, you said, that youth, as it's been conceived, is often not conceived of in ethnic terms. But a lot of people would dispute that. They would say that if you ask the young people of Addis, for example, a lot of them would say, yes, we are Oromo youth. That's how they would identify.
I know.
Right? So they're youth, but they would also identify in terms of ethnicity, and that's the same in other places as well. So then you have, it's not that it's only one or the other. So you have some of these contradictions, and then you have some youth that would be much more defined by class or education, because now they are, whatever. So their position is quite different.
Yeah, I mean, they are intersecting. I mean, you cannot say that they are mutually exclusive.
Right. So I think we'll get started, and if everyone is ready. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by the U.S. Congress in 1984 and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. My name is Ali Verji. I'm a senior advisor here to the Africa program at USIP, and welcome to the second in our Ethiopia discussion series. And also welcome to our online audience with the hashtag #ChangingEthiopia. There's a lot going on in Ethiopia, as we all know, with events every day unfolding that have significance, and I'm sure we're all eager to get to those events and to discuss them. But before we get to the here and now, we wanted to try and understand some of where things have come from. Today we'll be discussing ethnic federalism. Where did it come from? What is it? What is this idea of ethnic federalism, and where is it going? Some of us have heard and are following the situation in Sidama in the southern part of Ethiopia, and some of the issues there. There's also been the recent assassinations in the Amhara region. So this is a time where clearly the ethnic federal model is being questioned by a lot of Ethiopians and by people who are following Ethiopia. So we hope to get into some of those issues today and hopefully remove some of the mystery as well of what this concept is and how it's expressed and how it plays out in everyday life. So without further ado, let me introduce today's panel. Today, sitting to my immediate left is Dr. Johannes Gadamu, who is a lecturer in political science at Georgia Gwinnett College, just outside of Atlanta, and a commentator on political issues about the Horn of Africa. Johannes wrote his dissertation on ethnic federalism and the authoritarian survival in Ethiopia, so there's probably no one better qualified to speak to the subject today. And he's a frequent commentator and scholar of Ethiopian politics, and will also be speaking later today at USIP about the Gulf dimensions of involvement in the Horn of Africa and in Ethiopia. To his left is Dr. Daniel Maines, who also has an Atlanta connection, who finished his PhD at Emory, and is now Associate Professor of Anthropology and African Studies at the Honors College of the University of Oklahoma, just outside of Oklahoma City. His research explores the intersection between culture and economics in urban Africa, and he's the author of Hope is Cut, Youth, Unemployment, and the Future in Urban Ethiopia, and has also spent a lot of time in Awassa in the southern region, which we'll get to talk about a bit later. And then finally, to my right, is Alamayu Fantau Weldemariam, who was formerly a National Peace Advisor to Ethiopia's Ministry of Federal Affairs back in 2011, and was a scholar in residence at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And he's also taught at a number of other universities in both Ethiopia and the US. So thank you, gentlemen, all for joining us today. For the format, we are on the record and webcasting live. I'll try and moderate a conversation between our discussants here for the next hour or so, and then we'll turn to some questions and answers from the audience. So, ethnic federalism, this is a term we hear a lot. You talk to people about Ethiopia and they say, ethnic federalism this, ethnic federalism that. Johannes, I want to put the first question to you, something definitional. When we hear this term, ethnic federalism, and that Ethiopia is ethnically federal, what does this mean from a constitutional, from a legal point of view? I mean, what does the term actually mean? What does Ethiopia's constitution actually say? Can we remove some of this mystery of what ethnic federalism actually is? For those of us who are perhaps less familiar with this different federal model, and we think about federations in terms of the United States or Canada or an African federation like Nigeria. What is ethnic federalism? Can we start there?
Thank you so much, Ali. I appreciated the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. Ethnic federalism, you know, we call Ethiopia's federalism ethnic federalism, but some may call it you know, ethno-national federation. Some may call it with different names. But I think ethnic federalism is a name more or less suited for the kind of federal design that is in Ethiopia today. The constitution explains that the federal arrangement is created based on settlement patterns, ethnicity, and linguistic classifications as you know, the main or major you know, ways that the government tried to create this federal design. And why we call it ethnic federalism is because one, the government calls it ethnic federalism. I once, you know, when I was writing my dissertation a few years ago, I met someone who was somehow close to the prime minister, and the prime minister, the late prime minister Meles Zenawi, actually also calls it ethnic federalism, even though today some may disagree with that name. But why it came to be is that way, why Ethiopia opted to actually form its federal arrangement in that way is because of the narratives that were championed by those groups who actually were able to conquer political power in 1991.
So Johannes, before we get into the history, because we'll get there in a moment, and that is important to understand where this concept has come from, but can we just sort of focus in on what does it actually mean? So when we say, or at least on paper, right, the expression of it may be different, but on paper, what does the Constitution say? What does it mean?
The Constitution, I would look at it in two ways. One is the federal constitution, Ethiopia's constitution.
Right.
Ethiopia's constitution says that the government, right, and the constitution wants to empower different ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And the way to do that is by granting them these self-administration rights along ethnic lines. That's one. The second, and for me, is the most interesting part of Ethiopia's constitutional system is each and every regional state has its own constitution. And each constitution of any regional state, except I would say the Amhara regional state, starts with this notion that this and this group of this region have been exploited, oppressed by these old regimes, and now this constitution grants us our self-administrative rights, and we are these owners of this region. So basically, ethnic federalism, right, for the old oppressed peoples of Ethiopia gives them this ownership of their own regional states. So it championed group rights. And of course, the Constitution nowhere says it's against individual rights. But somehow, when they emphasized and focused more on group rights, ultimately it has costed quite a lot when it comes to individual rights.
Okay.
But that's just the concept in a nutshell.
All right, we'll come back to the history in a moment.
Yeah.
Alamayo, let me ask you the same question. So when we talk about ethnic federalism, from a definitional point of view, I mean, what does it mean? Can you add to that from your legal background?
I will be very straight. I will cut to the chase. What's ethnic about Ethiopia's federation? Because ethnicity is the organizing principle of the Ethiopian state.
Okay.
So take a look at the preamble of the Constitution. It begins with the phrase, "We, the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia." These are the authors of the Constitution.
This construct, yeah.
And one thing very important to note here is that the Constitution, in its definition of nations, nationalities, and peoples, doesn't slice and dice who nations, who the nationalities, and who the people are. It's just a generic reference to any group that shares a language, a culture, a psychological makeup, and a contiguous territory.
So those are some definitions, right? Because
Yes.
this is Article
So-
39 we're talking
Exactly.
about, and it
So
says...
so we have the preamble,
yeah.
which makes explicit who the authors of the Constitution are. You have Article 8,
Yeah.
very important, which is the sovereignty clause of the Constitution.
Right.
Sovereignty is based with the nations, nationalities, and peoples. Then what do you have? You have an ethnic constitution. You have an ethnic federation.
So to be specific about what Article 39 says here about nationality, it does define nationality, right? It says
Yes.
a group of people who have or share a large measure of a common culture or similar customs, mutual intelligibility of language, belief in a common or related identities, a common psychological makeup, and an identifiable, predominantly contiguous territory. So that's the constitutional starting point.
Yes.
But then from that, we have the 9 ethnic regions of Ethiopia. So can you explain how this concept, as it's been outlined in the Constitution, how does it actually manifest itself in Ethiopia?
So actually, Article 39 is a carryover from the transitional government's charter.
Yeah. This is before 1995.
Yes.
Yes.
So when the federative arrangement, when in 1991 EPRDF took over Addis, and they commissioned a body to draft the constitution, a 29-member commission, headed by the late Kafli Wadajo, a prominent liberal Democrat, I would say, which also includes the present president of the Supreme Court of Ethiopia, Maaz Ashnafi. They drafted the constitution. They submitted the constitution to the Council of Representatives. Then it was adopted by the Constituent Assembly. So when they took over power in 1991, they convened the July Conference on Peace, where various groups, political groups, and also rebel movements, the ones that played the key part in the drafting of this founding document, which is the charter, where actually the rebel movement is. Which is actually a misunderstanding to say that it was only dictated by EPRDF, because the OLF was also part of that initial exercise, though it left at a later stage, disgruntled by the number of seats that it was given in the legislature. So am I getting lost in the details, or
maybe let's try and zoom out a bit, so to say, how, before we get back into the history, because it is complicated, a lot happened.
So
what you said was that what we have today is a carryover from the pre-1995 constitutional arrangements. So what does ethnic federalism look like in Ethiopia today?
So what ethnic federalism did in the charter and the proclamation that founded the regional states, I think it was Proclamation 6 of 1992, is it established 14 regional states.
Right. More than
Not
what we have
9.
today. Yeah.
Exactly. Then, when it comes to the constitutional stage, it amalgamated 5 of the regional states that we now call Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples Regional States. Regions 7 to 11 were merged together to form SNNPR. Now, the question is, why is it that these regional states were merged together while the others kept? And is it really consistent with the organizing principle of the Constitution, where ethnicities are the authors of the Constitution?
Right.
Well, they did that actually for practical reason. And a solution to this problem was put in Article 47, where any group which wishes to establish its own state can demand for a statehood.
Right.
So this is what we are witnessing today. In the south, with the Sidama, with the Walaita, and 11.
And we'll come
Altogether,
back to
11
the
other
south
groups.
in a moment. Yeah.
So that's how the regional states were formed. So you have a list of the 9 regional states and 1 city, actually, not 2 cities. Redwa isn't recognized in the Constitution. It's not established as an autonomous state, as part of the federation in good standing. It was made a federal state later on by a grant of a charter to make it an autonomous city, accountable directly to the federal government, but not a part of, it's not in good standing as Addis Ababa, legally speaking.
Okay. So if we're to summarize, and Johannes, if I can come back to you, we have an Ethiopia today where there are 9 ethnically based federal states. We have the capital, Addis Ababa. We have Dirdar under a charter. And we have these provisions in the Constitution where you can have an ethnic region that has the right up to secession. That's constitutionally provided. It has happened. If we look at what has happened with Eritrea, right? There was a secession. So broadly speaking, this is the constitutional framework. Now, Alamayo has given us some of the background of what happened in that period between the end of the Derg regime, 1991, and the takeover of the EPRDF, and what happened prior to the adoption of the 1995 Constitution. But what I want to ask you is, where does this idea of ethnic federalism come from? And what are its intellectual and historical roots? Because, yes, we can say that's what's there, it's what's written on paper, it's what is implemented to an extent in Ethiopia, although we can differ perhaps on the extent of its implementation, as you've just pointed out. But where does this idea come from? Can you help orient us a little bit to its origins?
Thank you. I think those who actually came up with the system, I think they are geniuses. I'm not saying that in a good way. You know, federalism is a good thing. We know it works, right, in so many different countries, and we have it here working just fine, just great, actually. But in the United States, just to give you some kind of perspective, in the United States, we do have, you know, certain important democratic principles, like republicanism or popular sovereignty, great ideas such as separation of power and checks and balances. And federalism just happened to be one of these democratic principles because it's a result of that democratic compromise we had in the 1780s, right? We had this experiment with somehow close to unitary state under the British rule. Then we have that confederal structure, and the compromise happened to be federalism. In Ethiopia, it's not like that. It's not a compromise. It's not, let's just try something new. Ethiopia's politics since 1991 is not Ethiopia's politics. It is EPRDF's politics. And EPRDF's politics has always been about political survival. So when in 1991 they came up with this ethnic federal arrangement,
where did they come up with it from? I mean, even if we talk about the after 1991 period as being dominated by the EPRDF, where did this idea originate from? I mean, it didn't just come from nowhere.
There is this assertion that I do not fully buy in that assertion, but there is this socialist Albanian kind of principles that they may have inherited some of these ideas of, say, promoting group rights. Yeah. So that's just one. But federalism has always been out there, and federal arrangements can be constructed along different lines. Probably we can come up with up to 70, 80, if I can quote William Riker, even though we just have only less than 30 federal states worldwide. So the whole idea was just about establishing regional status in a way that you could use to empower group rights. Yeah. And they did that successfully when it comes to arranging these ethnic federal states. But there's just one major idea behind EPRDF's framers. That was to somehow punish certain groups and reward certain others. Looking at history very much closely is very important here. But suddenly, what happened is, instead of actually empowering groups all across Ethiopia, it benefited certain groups, probably 4 major regional states that are directly administered by EPRDF member political parties. EPRDF is this coalition political party that has 4 parties as its members. These parties administer 4 regional states, namely Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, and the southern region. All the other regions, 5 of the other regions, are administered by what the EPRDF officials call EPRDF affiliate political parties. But what happened is that they called these 5 other regional states, like the Somalis, the Afars, the Gabelas, and the Benishangul Gumuz regions, they called them developing regions, as if the other 4 are really developed. And what created is a 2-tier federal structure within the country. So those who are administered by EPRDF member parties are the ones that are running the country, even though one political party like TPLF was very much dominant in the past until like a few years ago, and now we have another party probably is taking the upper hand in the country. So the others, they are just, out there. I mean, there's the Somali region, the Afar region, and others that I mentioned are not really being treated the way they should be treated. So I think that's why some even go in very much radical ways and call it apartheid, because most of the minorities that this federal structure was established to empower are actually being really oppressed by the very constitutional structure. So I think that in that regard, it did not really achieve its objective. But if I may add a couple of points, because Alamaya raised two important questions. The Constitution is all, for example, the Article 39, which is really quite a carryover, yes, but it's just, did they forget to take it out after Eritrea seceded and when they came up with this 1995 Constitution? I don't think so. But such clauses, such articles are very, very important for us to look at, because I think these are the kinds of articles that created suspicion among others, distrust among political elites, regional states administrators, and the people at large. Right. So I don't think it's just a carryover by mistake, but it's just a purposely implanted seed that could unravel the Ethiopian state at some point in the future. I hope that will not be the case.
So what you're pointing to is this, the question that a lot of people are asking today is whether ethnic federalism is in crisis. And before we get to that point, let me bring in Daniel Maines. You've heard now, Daniel, what's been said about the origins, and of course it is contested as well, this idea that perhaps it originated with more of a Soviet Marxist interpretation of nationality. The other argument one can make is that this is in some degree a response to a historical phenomenon in Ethiopia of empire first and then a military government that was very unitary and centralized. But leaving aside the specifics of the explanation, what I want to ask you is first whether you agree with the characterization that you've heard so far, but I also want to bring in this question of youth. You've written and researched youth, and as we all know, Ethiopia today is a very young country, certainly younger than all of us here on the panel. How does this intersect as a question? You've written something very interesting a few years ago about this idea that youth aren't necessarily conceived of, and when we talk about youth, you meant urban and male youth in particular, are not necessarily conceived of in ethnic terms, that they don't see themselves ethnically. Can you explain that a little bit, what you were trying to get at in that argument as well?
Sure. I mean, just to, I think I'm not going to take issue with anything that's been said so far in terms of the history of ethnic federalism. I would just emphasize, because I do my research in Jima, which is in Oromia, just very close to the border with the Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples regions, as well as in Hawassa, which is the capital of the Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples region, and definitely from the perspectives of the Oromo people, as well as many of the people in the South, this issue of empire is very important in terms of understanding federalism and kind of a long-standing history of what people see as exploitation, loss of land, forced domination from the period of the late 19th century, continuing almost to the present. So that is an important context for understanding ethnic federalism. And of course, the southern region is the most diverse region of Ethiopia as well, with a high number of ethnic groups there as well, and all of those ethnic groups were essentially subjugated by the North, and so ethnic federalism is partially a response to that history. On the question of youth, I would maybe qualify that statement a little bit in saying that I don't argue that youth universally see themselves outside of the lens of ethnicity. Rather, particularly urban youth, In Jima, where I did my research, Jima is a very diverse city, similar also to Awassa, very diverse cities. In terms of the way that they were organizing themselves, was not on the basis of ethnicity. You saw highly diverse groups. If I was to ask people what their parents' ethnicity was, it could include people of Dauro, Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, Gurage, Kafa, Yem, all hanging out with each other, all spending time with each other. And so whereas their parents might have been more organized in terms of their social networks on the basis of ethnicity, for many of these young people, that was not the case. And for many of them, the working language within the cities was Amharic as well, regardless of what the language that their parents would speak. And the common things that brought them together was often economic struggles, issues of unemployment, common interests in leisure activities, whether that's playing sports or chewing a chat or a khat, which is common activity for young people in urban Ethiopia, especially Jima, whereas ethnicity was not necessarily the major kind of fundamental dividing line among these young people. I think that youth is also important in terms of the politics, state questions, just because of the power that young people have had, particularly within the past 5 years, beginning with the Oromo people's movement, the Oromo movement, and then now with the Sidama as well. I can talk about that perhaps later when we get to that, but just like the youth as a political force that is rooted largely in economic issues. So it may seem odd to say that ethnicity is not an important issue for youth, given the major role that youth have had in all of these ethnic movements. But that's something that's emerged recently, and also I think that when I'm decoupling ethnicity from youth, that's largely in an urban environment as well.
And just to stay with you for a moment, Daniel, no one is suggesting that. Certainly I wasn't suggesting this is a universal finding. We've got to qualify that carefully. But given that Ethiopia is rapidly urbanizing, that its population is also rapidly becoming younger and increasing in size. I mean, what is the implication of the fact that this characteristic, age or profession or education or other dimensions of class or gender as well, can be decoupled from ethnicity? I mean, what's the implication of that for this federal construct?
Well, I mean, cities are very tricky for an ethnic federalism. And as my colleagues have pointed out, ethnic federalism is based on the idea that you can arrange a region around a very specific ethnicity. Cities throughout Ethiopia don't work that way. Whereas the rural areas in some cases are quite homogenous, cities are not. They're highly diverse, and that's the reason why, one of the reasons why Addis Ababa and then later Jeridawa became kind of separate federal cities. But even if you look at other cities throughout the country, like Hawassa, like Jima, they are not dominated by a particular ethnicity. And so it's very difficult then to put this highly diverse urban population into that package of the Oromo region, or potentially, in the case of Awassa, into the Sidama region, where the population of the city doesn't necessarily match up with that region as a whole. And particularly when you have a large number of people within the city that, number one, perhaps don't identify with the region, the ethnic group that governs the region, and perhaps secondly, don't even identify with their parents' ethnicity. Many of the young people may even just identify simply as Ethiopian. Then that becomes tricky to fit those cities within the context of ethnic federalism. And that's created well, we'll probably get to this later, but that's one of the reasons why the 2005 elections, urban areas went so much, almost entirely for the opposition. Was one of the key reasons was because of that kind of rough fit between diverse urban areas and with the policies of ethnic federalism. And then changes in urban policy since then have been partially a reaction to that dynamic.
Thanks. Alamai, let me come back to you. So,
can I respond to the historical question?
Let me ask you something first, and then you can weave in your answer. So, what we've just heard from Daniel Maines is this idea that ethnicity, to some extent, can also be mutable, right? It can change depending on the circumstances and so on. And I don't think anyone would entirely disagree with that concept. One of the things you've written is that ethnicity in Ethiopia is a noble lie. By which you mean that it's been a useful organizing principle. I think if we can briefly summarize what you mean by that. But if it's a noble lie, or a lie at all, then what are the implications for it being a useful organizing principle
Okay.
going forward? And
Okay.
if you want to weave in your historical answer there as well.
Okay, so to answer this question, I still have to go back to the historical question that the two colleagues were responding to. The historical question has two parts, in my understanding. The first part is the question of the origin of ethnic federalism as a theoretical construct. Where does ethnic federalism as a theoretical construct come from? One question.
Yes.
The second part of that question, in my mind, is what factors prompted the emergence or the advent of ethnic federalism in Ethiopia? Two historical questions. The first is political theoretical. I will start by attempting to answer that question first. The history of ethnic federalism goes back to the history of the doctrine of the theory of self-determination. The origin is Soviet Union. Before Soviet Union, in the run-up to the revolution, there were intellectual debates around that issue. Most prominently were debates between Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg and around self-determination. And the most prominent theoretician of that doctrine was V.I. Lenin. But the person who had the final say on that was Stalin, unfortunately.
So if we can...
We need to disabuse the Western audience here, because we are always biased against Soviet and Soviet stuff. Let's not forget that self-determination was made popular by none other than Woodrow Wilson. And it made its way into the twin international human rights instruments of 1966, Article 1, ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, we have this balanced view of the doctrine of self-determination. Let's turn to the second part of this political question, which is what made ethnic federalism tick in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Well, ethnic federalism was a historical necessity. Why do I say that it was a historical necessity? It wasn't a luxury. I mean, it wasn't just, I mean, you had those things and like, let's settle down. You had this A, B, C, D options and let's settle down for A. No, there was no other option on the table. I mean, it was a historic necessity. What was the history? We have to go back to the era that we call the era of princes, where parts of Ethiopia called regions, you had regional lords. And the first person who tried to bring regionalism to an end, who tried to unify Ethiopia, just as in European history, we call this unification. Yeah, you have Bismarck. In Germany, you have...
right. I mean,
So this was, the first was Theodore, King Theodore, Theodorus II. I mean, there is a brilliant study of this part of history, the unification process, written by not a very academic historian, but he's the best historian ever. Tekles Adikmokria, a 3-volume study of Ethiopian history of unification. The first is as a Theodorus in Ethiopia, and which roughly translates as Emperor Theodore and the unification of Ethiopia, or Ethiopian unity. The second in that installment is Emperor Johannes and the unification of Ethiopia. And the third and final in the installment is Emperor Menelik and the unification of Ethiopia. To me, the founding father of modern Ethiopia, the modern Ethiopian state is Emperor Menelik. We can
agree.
We can disagree on this. I mean, we can fight over this.
But let's
So what happened is, in the unification process, in the empire building process, some call it nation building, but I don't call it nation building, but because there isn't a single nation.
Right.
It's a nation of nationalities.
Right.
It's a nation of nations. I mean, using the word nation, I mean, loosely. So the The unification process had these two aspects. One is modernizing the state, and another is centralizing the state structure. It was brought to the modernization project, and the centralization project was had further progress under Emperor Haile Selassie. The problem now is that centralization process was taken to a breaking point.
Right.
By the military regime.
Sorry, if I can summarize what you're saying.
So when the PLF came in 1991.
Hold on, yeah. So what we're saying is, in some respect, ethnic federalism is a response to that centralization. Is that fair enough to say?
Yes.
So the question then for me to put to you is, if that's a response to this centralization, but the basic problem, or a basic problem here, is that we talk about self-determination, it also implies that there is some certainty to that entity, right? That if ethnicity is changeable, if it isn't fixed, if by marrying somebody or having a parent that comes from one group or another, your ethnicity can change, how do you reconcile the possibility of achieving that kind of self-determination?
Yeah, so one thing that I forgot was like the progenitors, I mean, the main players were also ethnic-based liberation movements.
Right.
We should keep this
Which
in
is
mind.
important, yeah.
Now, to turn to your question. Yes, to my mind, ethnicity is not something fixed,
Right.
something unchanging. To me, ethnicity is a social, historical construct.
Right.
It's fluid, it's dynamic, it changes. Someone, I mean, if you have the luxury, the privilege to live through different regimes long enough to live long enough, one person who might identify himself as Amhara might find himself on the other end,
Right.
maybe a Tigray. You know, if you ask me what I was growing up, where I was born and raised, well, that part of Ethiopia was a part of what was called during the Derg, the Wollo province, which now is part of Tigray. But if you ask me, like, I was a Wollo, yeah? Yes, of course I was a Wollo. Yeah. Does it contradict with your identity now as a Tigray? It doesn't. Why doesn't it contradict with that perception of my identity? Because, at home, I mean, it's language, yeah, one of the criteria. At home, my parents speak native, they are Tigrinya native speakers. But while raising their children, they weren't talking to us in Tigrinya. I mean, we used to think like Tigrinya is when our relatives come from the countryside. They speak Tigrinya, but we don't respond to them in Tigrinya, we respond to them in Amharic, and we say, this kid is spoiled. But the thing is, they understand, we mutually understand. Mm-hmm. So it was like, the thing was about urbanization. Yeah. It was like a modern thing to do, Mm-hmm. Speak Amharic was a modern thing. Because it was part of the modernization project of the past regimes, of Haile Selassie, of Menelik, of Johannes. It was Theodorus who made Amharic the language of the court, the official language. Johannes, a Tigray himself, made Amharic his court language, an official language. So the project was about empire building.
But at least now on paper,
but
there
this
is
was
no state language,
yes.
right? There is no state language. Even if Amharic is the lingua franca to some extent, there is no state language. So, what you're describing is not necessarily what is constitutionally foreseen or provided for.
Yeah.
But let me come back to you, Johannes. I think, there's a lot of complication to understanding this, and there are a lot of different dimensions to it. I think one of the useful ways that you've framed it to help us understand in what you've written as well is as a patron-client relationship. Can you explain what you mean by that? I mean, who is the patron or the patrons in this? Who are the clients? How does that analogy that we might be familiar with from other contexts explain modern Ethiopia?
Thanks. I would also touch on a couple of points that Alamayo discussed, but first let me just address your question. The ethnic federalism, as an institutional design was or has been serving the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front as a framework to extend its lifespan. It is a coalition with nothing but political survival ambitions. And for that to happen, even if such regional states were formed along ethnic lines, even although these regions were, say, empowered with the self-administrative rights, they were not, in practical terms, self-administering, administering that regional state. Instead, for example, when Meles Zenawi was the prime minister, each regional state had advisory boards or advisory offices, and some of the advisors assigned to each regional state's presidents were actually more powerful than the presidents of the regional states themselves. That was his way of manipulating and maneuvering that federal structure. And even though we do call it a federal structure or ethnic federal arrangement, Ethiopia was very much centralized.
So this comes back to what you were saying as the two-tier model of federalism earlier, right? I mean, in some sense.
In some sense, that's tied to that, but also as a whole.
Right.
Even the first tier of federalism, that belongs to, say, to the 4 regional states. There you have probably an individual who is very much loyal to the prime minister, who is serving as an advisor to the president of Oromia.
So if this federalism was unequal or uneven also, where does the client, where is the patron in this system? I mean, how does that map onto this explanation you're providing now?
So Ethiopia is a party state. When I say party state, it's just a very deep party state. That is also one reason that is really challenging the current reformist prime minister. I think he has some positive, he wants to do good, but he's been also, challenged by that deep state structure. So what you see is the government, the bureaucratic line is not only inefficient, but it was weakened by the very strong political party apparatus. So EPRDF's, headquarters in Addis Ababa, has this power over the Amara Democratic Party's office in Bahar Dar and vice versa. And what happens is that those elites at the center co-opt those at regional states. And the regional states do not have this independence when it comes to proposing policies or implementing it the way they would like to implement it based on the needs of their regional states. But it's always based on the interests of the elites at the center. So there is a clear co-optation mechanisms in play. And that ethnic federal arrangement made it very much possible for the elites at the center, right? These elites could be composed of these 4 political parties that, of course, make up the EPRDF coalition. And they are able to co-opt, right, those at the regional states, and that definitely served as a framework for political survival. But here, one thing that I would like to add and go back to also with what Alamayo said is, in 1991, as Alamayo said, ethnic federalism is, just a result of this historical necessity, and there was no any other option. I agree, there was no any other option on, on the table, but it was just because the liberation movement that had this opportunity to seize political power in Ethiopia wanted to make sure that there is no any other option but ethnic federal arrangement. Again, one thing is, one reason is because they wanted to punish some and reward others. But even those people, just to my, disgust at times, those people they wanted to reward or empower are actually now the most oppressed. Right? The Somalis or the Afars or the Gambelas or the many minorities in the southern region, they are the ones that are very much oppressed. And it's the fact that the EPRDF, or especially those who are presenting themselves as the protectors of the federal arrangement today, especially the Tigrayan ethno-nationalists and the Oromo ethno-nationalists, that is not true. If they are really championing if they are really saying they are championing group rights. One, in academic terms, it's just very clear that once you respect an individual's right, it comes naturally that you will also respect group rights. But at the same time, there's also one fact that they never ever entertain any PRDF's politics when it comes to group rights, especially if you go to any Amhara region like Gondar or Gojam or Tigray, Tigrayan region, or any rural part of Oromia, anywhere in the country, you see that women are the most oppressed members of the society who are suffering so much. You see children in their rights to education, or there's so many minorities who are being displaced just for state-led infrastructure projects. There are so many issues that we can tie to group rights agenda that are not really working.
So let me ask you this then. Is it that the ethnic federal model is broken, or is it that its implementation is problematic? I mean, this is the key question here. You said that the idea was the people who were oppressed should no longer be oppressed, and today they are. Is it because the model has not been implemented correctly, or is it there's something fundamentally defective about the model itself? Just briefly.
Let me just try to, as an academic, I'm all about the truth and just the facts, and I have to make sure that whatever I say is very much balanced. One, it is defective, absolutely. It's just the worst ever institutional design that Ethiopia ever had. In fact, I would say that, in what others call, including Almayo, called the empire, there were better rights to the Ethiopian people than today.
But again, is that a question of implementation or action? Because the rights are there under the Constitution, they're individual rights, as you said. The idea of protection exists.
Everything starts with the intention. What did those who actually framed this ethnic, federal constitution want to do? What did they want to achieve? What they aspired to achieve is nothing but political survival. And they wanted, those who had the political power at the time wanted to present themselves as the arbiters, the ones who actually could keep Ethiopia together. When it comes to ethnic conflicts, right, there is this vast political science literature that ethnicity in and of itself may not cause ethnic conflict. But if a certain minority group actually controls political power, it may actually cause ethnic conflict. Today, what you have is Ethiopia, which is #1 in terms of its size of IDPs, right? Political violence is rampant. We will talk about Sidamas later, but the displacement is not, many in Ethiopia actually mention Rwanda, okay, our fate will be just like that, our fate will be these worst cases of genocide. But you know what? What if those displacees, those evictees actually refuse to be evicted? What would happen? Of course, genocide, nothing else. If you have 3 million IDPs, I don't know, I think we are worse than Rwanda. And that is the issue of the defects of ethnic federalism. But when it comes to implementation as well, some within the ethno-nationalist camp, they say that it is just the best possible solution that we have. It's just that it's not implemented. I agree with them that it is not implemented well. That means these regions do not have this self-administration capacities that they should have had if it was implemented correctly, in one hand. But the way they actually explain it, however, is very much in different way. They want it because it is conducive to their homogenization of these regional states. There is this project right now, just like Daniel earlier said, right? In Hawassa, you have this very much diverse urban citizenry, urban residents, that do not really identify with the Sidama, which is the zonal administration that's in charge of that area. So what happens? Those Sidama ethno-nationalists want to make sure that the city becomes homogeneous in the long run, in the short run. That causes displacement. So when they say it should be implemented, right, and implemented the way the Constitution puts it, they are not saying that, oh, we have this political right to administer our service and we should have it fully. It's not. It's just about homogenization. It's just about making sure that none Sidamas or none Oromos in Oromia or other regions are not in any way, able to exercise their political rights in those regions that they live in. So that's why I agreed in those two questions.
I know you have a view on the question of implementation versus design, and I'll come to you in a moment, but I want to come to Daniel Mains first, because one of the other dimensions that Johannes has just alluded to a bit earlier is infrastructure, and we could also perhaps also think about federalism in fiscal terms and in terms of resources, but coming to infrastructure in particular, one of the interesting things I think we could talk about a little bit are the unforeseen implications or consequences of having a federal structure of this kind. Can you say a little bit about how infrastructure, and particularly roads in this case, has also contributed to both a changing Ethiopia in terms of how ethnic federalism has played out and how it's actually manifesting itself? Because of course since 1991, and particularly since 2005, let's say, there has been a huge expansion of roads across the country, of investment in infrastructure. How is this affecting? It's not something we would necessarily think of as having ethnic dimensions. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, I can explain that. I wonder if also would it be helpful to maybe provide a little bit more background about the position of Hawassa?
We'll come to Hawassa in a moment, but I just want to get this idea.
Yeah, of course, infrastructure is very important. I would argue, just a plug for my book that's coming out next month. It's all about infrastructure. It's called Under Construction, coming out with Duke University Press, and it's no coincidence that you have I think this looks like a photo of the train,
yes.
Probably connecting Diradawa to Addis, or Djibouti, yeah. So in some ways, Ethiopia, I think within the past 10 to 15 years, could almost be defined as an infrastructural state. I mean, huge billions of dollars going into dams, going into roads, going into telecommunications, and this has implications for ethnicity in a number of ways. Just for example, if you take the case of Hawassa actually has a capital of the Southern Nations Nationalities Peoples region, some of the best infrastructure that I've seen compared to other cities within Ethiopia. Excellent road systems comparatively to other cities. And what that does is it becomes a form of distribution of resources. So when we think about ethnic federalism doesn't necessarily have any implications, on paper at least, for the way that resources are distributed. Right. But in practice, it often does shift that. And that's where a lot of the tensions come into play, is when resources themselves, like access to roads, like access to telecommunications, access to electricity, access to water, when those things become attached to ethnicity, then that creates a large amount of tension, particularly in an urban environment. So when you look at road construction, when roads are built in areas that benefit one ethnic group as opposed to another ethnic group, that's going to naturally cause tensions to be created. And that's something that's happened in the Hawassa case, where new roads were explicitly built with the idea of kind of benefiting the Sidama people for political reasons, to kind of bring them back into the EPRDF, to bring them back into the ruling party, bring them out of the opposition. On the other hand, the construction of roads doesn't always work out in the manner that's expected. There's a number of cases where it would appear that these new roads are perhaps going to benefit a particular ethnic group, but due to long-standing historical dynamics, it simply doesn't work that way at all. And then you have cases like, if you go down further in the south, also within the southern region, where so for example, the Gibi 3 dam that's being built or actually the construction there is finished, which has impacted or destroyed the livelihoods of close to 500,000 people. This becomes a different type of center-periphery relationship. In this case, it's not, it's really the kind of the urban centers, the manufacturing, the wealth that is benefiting at the expense of the pastoralist people, the people who have relied on the rivers there historically for access to water, fishing, water for their livestock historically. So a different type of divide is created that's not necessarily along the lines of ethnicity, but more along the lines of pastoralist versus urban dwellers in terms of these kind of economic shifts. And so the dams, the roads themselves create a large amount of displacement that doesn't always work along ethnic lines. Again, coming back to the case of Awassa, when new roads are built in the city center, the people that were living alongside those roads are displaced to the outskirts of the cities. This tends to be people who are already economically marginalized, people who are renting property as opposed to owning property. And this doesn't break down neatly along ethnic lines. Ethnicity has something to do with it, but it's also class lines as well. In my research, most of the people that were displaced to the outskirts of the city were single women who were heads of households. So gender lines come into play here as well. And so I think that one of the things that thinking through infrastructure in order to understand policies and the implications of ethnic federalism is it kind of takes us beyond just thinking about politics, difference, inequality in terms of ethnicity, and thinking about some of these other issues, whether it's the marginalization of people on the very peripheries, whether it's class-based, whether it's gender-based, that infrastructure interacts with that. And infrastructure, particularly in a state that is investing such huge amounts of money. I mean, I think Ethiopia right now is number 3 in the world in terms of the amount of public funds per capita or as a percentage of GDP that is invested into infrastructure. When such a huge amount of public funds are put into infrastructure, that becomes a way of trying to understand literally how inequality is concretized in the form of roads, in the form of hydroelectric dams, other types of things. And then there's also the jobs that are created with that infrastructure that's highly important as well. And then that connects back to the issue of youth as sort of a potential for unrest as well, which becomes part of this political question.
Right. So of course there are other dimensions to how inequality is manifested, or whether it's based on gender or class or occupation. But if we can think about the connections between the federal model in Ethiopia and economic development or infrastructural development, and come back to Awassa in particular. I mean, one of the things that you had said before is that from the perspective of the EPRDF, that the success of Awassa in terms of its economic success, its development and so on, had legitimized, in their eyes at least, the policies of ethnic federalism. That was a 2016 view, so you know we're free to adapt it since. But how can that be the case? I mean, can you explain that for us? How is it that the success of Awassa, which has become a much bigger place, a much more developed place, the roads are better, infrastructure is better, et cetera, how does that connect with this idea, which predates Abiy Ahmed's coming to power, of course, but was there, of legitimizing ethnic federalism as a model? Well,
so in that paper, I actually argue that Awassa, if you go to Awassa, it's oftentimes celebrated as the city of diversity, city of love, it's talked about. And one of the themes, the slogans of the EPRDF is unity through diversity, billboards everywhere in the town. And so the town becomes this kind of symbol of unity through diversity. But at the same time, I argue that the model of ethnic federalism necessarily destroys that diversity because it doesn't work well. The diverse city doesn't work well with the ethnic federalist model. So Awassa is the capital of the southern regions I mentioned. It would be the capital of the Sidama region. The Sidama have occupied, they're the largest ethnic group in the south, in the southern nation's nationalities. People's region, Sidama are about 4 million people. They're the largest by population ethnic group. But Awassa historically is a new city. It was only founded in the 1950s, and the population was not dominated by the Sidama people historically. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, only around 10% of the population was Sidama at that time. The vast majority of the population was either coming from the north, but many of the people from other groups in the south, like the Walaita, Kambata, Hadia people, but also from Amhara, Oromo. So highly diverse city. Then we kind of jump ahead to the, and statehood, advocating for statehood has historically been an issue that Sidama, beginning with the coming of EPRDF, have advocated for. So we jump ahead then to the 2005 election when cities across Ethiopia supported the opposition. One of the ways that the EPRDF struggled to bring kind of cities back into the party system and to support their party away from the opposition was to try to homogenize the population of the cities. So after the 2005 election, Awassa expanded its urban boundaries to bring in a larger portion of Sidama people, because the people living around the city are Sidama, not the people actually in the city. So with that expansion of the boundaries, suddenly Sidama became the majority population within the city. The reason for that is because diverse cities don't necessarily work well with this ethnic federalist model, because it becomes a question of how do you represent that diversity. So once Awassa becomes a Sidama city, then it's a little bit easier to fit that into the ethnic federalist model. So to go to your question, from a symbolic standpoint, the Awassa as this diverse city works very well with the EPRDF rhetoric. From a practical standpoint, in terms of people's voting behavior, in terms of who they actually support, it did not work very well because of the lack of fit with ethnic federalism. So there's been a very conscious attempt to make Awassa a Sidama city, whether that's through infrastructure, to build roads that connect with Sidama neighborhoods, whether that's through things like at Awassa University, where I worked for a year, where it's about giving positions to Sidama people, whether it's through making all of the city administration Sidama. Then by making the city more homogenous in that sense, the idea is that can then be connected with that ethnic federalist structure. And so the kind of the unity through diversity doesn't always fit so well with the actual ethnic federalism through practice.
Almay, let's talk a bit more about Sidama. It's been in the news recently, last week. What exactly is going on there? Let's provide some background first. That on the 18th of July 2018, so just over a year ago, the Sidama Council, the representatives of the zone, tried to exercise their rights under the constitution to move towards creating their own state, right? So this is what you were talking about earlier, that the southern region is also very diverse. You would have Sidama coming out of the southern region and moving from their current status as a zone to a state, potentially, assuming the referendum was held and voted in favor of that outcome. That was what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah.
What has happened since that request was made, or that attempt to use that request under the Constitution was made? Can you explain to us a little bit about what's going on?
Okay. What does Sidama people in the southern nations and nationalities, people's regional state, let's call it SNNPR for short, such a marathon, like, is they demanded, in accordance with Article 47 of the Constitution,
Right.
so Article 3B,
Right.
for statehood, independent state. And this happened more than a year ago now, a few days more than a year ago. And according to that constitutional provision, there is a schedule within which, a year, within which the regional state has to organize, the state council has to organize a referendum on whether or not.
They should become a state or not.
Yes. The request was submitted because, the mandate, the constitutional mandate, the authority falls within the State Council. But because the state doesn't have the resources, organizing posts, it was given to the National Electoral, the NEBE,
The Election Commission, yes.
because it's the body that's in charge of polling, whether it's elections, national, regional, and local elections, or
State.
referenda. So what happened was, with Abiy coming to power in April, and the new head of the NEB appointed 8 months ago, they missed out on the deadline. They needed to move forward with it.
They didn't organize a referendum
They didn't
by
organize-
the constitutional deadline.
Within the deadline.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, I don't have the answers for that, with certainty, but I can speculate. Why did they fail to organize the referendum within the deadline? One reason, I guess, is because Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was giving them contradictory signaling, contradictory messaging.
When you say
Because-
they, you're talking about the Sidama people, or who are you talking
The
about?
State Council.
The State Council.
The State Council, the NABE, yeah. Because Abiy came with this rhetoric of unity, of reforming the federal system itself.
Yes.
But again, after several months in office, he came out and said, the ethnic federal system is there to stay. It's not something negotiable. So maybe I thought they were waiting on him. What is he gonna do about this, right? Or maybe the regional council were concerned about losing their power. You have a party, SEPDEM, which is a member,
Yeah.
in good standing, of the coalition,
yeah,
the APRF coalition. How are you going to maintain your seat in the parliament and ex officio, a kind of minister,
Yeah.
supervising a certain government agency, without, when you are like attacking your own party? There won't be SEPDEM anymore. If Sidama is going its own way,
Yeah.
if Walaita is going its own way, and all the 11 zonal administrations that requested for statehood. So they kind of woke up some night, some morning, they woke up and said, where are we gonna go? With this kind of demand is proliferating at this rate, we need to put this thing on hold.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's good. Now SEPDEM held an 11-day long meeting in Addis. I don't even know why they couldn't have their meeting in their own capital,
But
in
anyway,
Hawassa.
they did.
But whatever they did,
Yeah.
they did it in Addis. And they came out with something very impenetrably, very dark. Really, it's easier for me to decode Aristotle's metaphysics than their statement. You can't make head or tail of it, what the parties stand on that, you cannot figure it out from that statement alone. Then a few days, again, they convened in Hawassa, and they said, there is a study, they call it scientific, I don't know what scientific means is that statistics? These days, you do something and you call it scientific, whatever they say, according to the panel of experts we convened and the study that we commissioned, they came up with 3 options. The first is to keep the SNNPR
Yeah.
intact as it is.
So keep the region as it is.
Keep the region as it is.
Okay. Second.
The second option is to split it into 2 or 3, but no more.
Right.
The third is for Sidama to hold a referendum.
Yes.
But they are not answering the questions of the other.
Yeah.
It's only for Sidama.
Yeah. But Sidama is the only one who has fulfilled the requirements
Yes.
so far.
So still, what they are signaling isn't clear. It's contradictory.
What's the contradiction?
The contradiction is because the NEBE said
Yeah.
it's going to hold the elections, the referendum, in 5 months.
Right.
Yeah? But the party in Hawassa is saying different.
Yeah.
It's coming through a back door and saying like, it's taking back what the Constitution is giving them in one hand and it's taking it in the other.
But how is it a contradiction? I mean, the party doesn't decide, right? If you follow the Constitution, the constitutional right has been asserted, they get the opportunity to have
That
their
will take
referendum.
this will take us to the question of the disconnect between the practice and the design in the
Yeah.
Constitution. So in practice, we have EPRDF, and the modus operandi so far
Yes.
has been for EPRDF to run the nation with the federation as if it were a unitary state.
Yeah.
Because it's one part, they belong to one coalition. They are also joined by the allies in the remaining 5 regional states. So it was easy for them. They have the dominance in the legislature. They have the party apparatus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever the party is saying, is gonna hold.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Okay. Johannes, one of the consequences of the failure of the election board to hold the referendum as scheduled was that some of the organizers of the Sidama state, or some of the proponents of it, said, we're going to declare our own state. Said, we waited, we tried to follow, and we're going to declare if they don't give us our own state. That didn't ultimately happen, although it was threatened. Although the possibility of that happening in the future still remains, I suppose, that it's not precluded. How do you see this situation in Awassa and in Sidama in particular playing out? Because it's unclear whether the election board can hold this referendum for whatever reason, or let's say there are doubts about whether it will move forward with doing so. People have said we're not prepared to wait any longer. There has been violence as a result of the failure to hold the referendum on time or to move towards some negotiated settlement of one kind or another. So that risk remains. We've heard, as Daniel Maines has already said, that Awassa has become a more exclusively Sidama city and wasn't necessarily historically so. So we have that grievance now also over the status of Awassa the city, not only Sidama the zone, but what happens to Awassa the city, whether the state government has to leave, if the southern nations changes. What is the implication, as some have argued as well, about this possibility of a southern region unraveling, or the dominoes sort of following, that if it starts in the Sidama, and then the Walaita, and then the people from North Omo, and so on and so on. Is that something that you see as a risk? Is there something that can be done about it? How do you see things moving forward?
Thank you, Ali. It's a huge risk. I think if I could say, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was able to do, few things really successfully. I think he was able to manage the recent debacle associated with the Sidama really well. He recognized that it's going to be a major threat to the country. And here is how. As Alamayo mentioned most of the points, especially associated with the National Electoral Board.
Yeah.
But the National Electoral Board also sent a letter to the Sidama, the committee that is in charge of this statehood demand, asking them what's going to be the status of Hawassa. Because Hawassa is a city is the capital city of the southern region, and most of the southern regions, diverse ethnic groups or Ethiopians in the south have invested a lot financially, emotionally, in so many different ways in that city. And that city happened to be the symbol of unity in the south, and of course to all Ethiopians. And when I think of the southern Ethiopian, I usually don't call it the southern nations, nationalities, peoples region. I just call it southern Ethiopia. It is just, we call it Little Ethiopia. And if this ethnic federal arrangement is to work, or if there is a real desire, a positive desire to actually make it work, I think we need more of the southern Ethiopian kind of regions in Ethiopia, in the northern Ethiopia, in the south, in the western Ethiopia or the eastern Ethiopia.
But hang on a second. The southern region is very diverse in terms of its composition, and a lot of people would say that the Amhara region or the Oromo region, while there are minorities, they don't have the same 80 group type composition that you find in the southern region. So how does that work to have more northern regions like the south?
With the exception of few groups in Ethiopia, I would say mostly the Amharas, followed by the Gurages, and then Tigray. I may be wrong in terms of how I rated them, which are these groups who actually live all across Ethiopia.
Yes.
Most Ethiopians, most ethnic groups actually live in very much, certain localities. So Sidamas are usually found in Sidamas. I have never, growing up in Gondar, which is the Amhara region, I have never met a Sidama growing up, or very, very, very few Oromos. But Tigrayans, of course, quite a lot. There's lots of Tigrayans in Gondar. So I think that Abiy Ahmed understood the threat not only against Ethiopia as a state, but also a threat that is coming from ethno-nationalist campus against EPRDF's rule of Ethiopia. Because most ethno-nationalists, the TPLF, although it is within the EPRDF, there is this, I wouldn't call it disrespect, but the federal government can do much in Tigray today. ODP, which is the Oromo Democratic Party, where the prime minister comes from, the prime minister cannot get probably anything that he wants in Oromia today, even though it is a party that he actually chose. So the federal government at the center, or the central government in Ethiopia, is very much disconnected from most other regions. And the federal government cannot actually send its police forces or military forces to actually control displacements and political violence all across the country. But one thing that they, at least the way they want it, one thing that happened before the Sidama issue is what happened in Jigjiga with a guy, Abdi Ile, who actually wanted to secede from Ethiopia.
This is the Somali region.
This is the Somali region. And he put that on the table. And Abiy and the late, the late military chief of staff acted decisively. And that regional president is now in jail. And Abiy, actually, I raised this issue because Abiy reminded the group that is, managing this Sidama statehood question, okay, if you do not, right, follow this constitutional guideline and the government's guidance in terms of how to actually handle the Sidama statehood issue.
And what you're referring to is if they've gone ahead and declared their own.
Exactly, because they wanted to, declare on July 11th, 2011, right? Yeah. They wanted to declare that. And he said, if you do so, what happened to the Somali region would also repeat itself in Sidama, because he knew that it was going to be a major threat against the sovereignty of the southern region, in terms of its regional sovereignty, but also with huge ramifications, as Alamayo said, to EPRDF, because the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement, SEPDM, would be in a very much weaker position. And the ACPDM, with its leader, Mufreyat, her name is Ms. Mufreyat, she's the Minister of Peace, is a major ally to the Prime Minister. So he recognized that part. But I would like just to add a couple of points here, just maybe just one point. What is the good thing about the decision by the government and the electoral board, which is really under huge pressure right now, the electoral board, is because there are so many other things in different regions that should be on the agenda. Today they just postponed, a few hours ago, they postponed the election in Addis Ababa and Redwa city councils as well.
The local elections.
Yeah, the local elections, because they are really under huge pressure. What is really important is they, I think, have realized and understood what is really behind the IJETO, there's a youth group that's behind the Sidama statehood question, which is using very much violent acts to push its agenda. And also the committee behind the statehood question is that, just like Daniel said earlier, there has been that homogenization project in the city of Hawassa for a long time, but it's not complete.
Right.
But the ability of having your own regional state could actually facilitate that agenda of creating a very homogeneous Sidamani state. Because what happened the day the electoral board released that statement was so many non-governmental organizations closed their offices, businesses were closed. Hawassa is a very beautiful city with so many resorts. The occupancy rate for their hotels and resorts is under 5%, and there's a lot of huge economic strain, and many non-Sidamas started to leave the city.
But how does the state itself, how does this zone becoming a state lead to the zone becoming more homogeneous? Because outside of Hawassa, the city, the zone itself, yes, there may be some minorities, but it is predominantly Sidama, right? So becoming a state doesn't necessarily make it more homogeneous.
Exactly. Ethnic federalism doesn't mean that at least we all understand and the government understands, but sometimes ethno-nationalists in any camp may not actually buy into that idea. Ethnic federalism doesn't entitle each ethnic group its own state, right? If it's a very small minority, it could be, it could have its own waradas, sort of like a county or zonal administration. And as long as they are in charge of that zonal administration, they are basically administrating themselves. But having a regional state would mean for them, right, having more say in national politics, having the bigger slice of these national resources and influence, and the ability to also create or establish new political alliances across ethnic lines when it comes to engaging and moving forward with the national political environment. But here is also one major problem that the government already understands, and we also in the academics or in the media also definitely understand. That is, if the Sidama, say, secedes from the southern regional state, there will be an equally most populated, also bigger geographically sized Gedio zone will be basically left out as an enclave, still part of the southern region, but outside the state border, regional borders of the southern region.
Right.
That creates a huge issue. And here is why. The Gedios, right, it's a minority ethnic group, right, minority in Ethiopian standards of over 100 million people, but they're just close to 2 million. About 1 million of them, or close to 1 million of them, were displaced from Guji Oromia because most of the Gedio zone is in the southern region. But Gedios, ethnic Gedios also live inside Oromia in the other side. And over 1 million of them were displaced. And until recently, the OLF, the group that returned from Eritrea after invitation by the Prime Minister, was actually in charge of this zonal administration in Guji Oromia, and was actually responsible for the displacement and also for preventing the return of the Gedios to where they belong. So there is this huge dilemma. It will be a national catastrophe. It will be something that actually, the Sidama issue, that's what I'm talking about. Sidama issue would definitely escalate the tensions around that area, the ethnic tensions around that area. Violence could be spiraling. And definitely the issue of IDPs that has now put Ethiopia, I mean, we are always in the international headlines, but the issue of IDPs is one of the most devastating and hurtful, really, phenomena about Ethiopia today. And the Sidama issue, if they were able to succeed, would definitely be a blow to Ethiopian unity and, of course, to the hope of the country in terms of how we actually move forward.
Daniel Maines, do you share that concern about what may happen in the southern region? I mean, there is this argument that has been made by certain analysts and scholars that if you allow, or if Sidama is allowed to secede, then other zones of the region may follow. Is that a problem? For one question, I mean, there is this question of allowing, which I find interesting if it's constitutionally an entitlement that is there. But beyond that, looking specifically at Sidama, if we can come back to that as well, what are the implications if this referendum or constitutional process isn't followed? I mean, how do you see it playing out?
Right. No, those are great questions. I mean, and definitely, it's already begun with other ethnic groups. The Walaita are due, the policy is first you have to request it, and then there's a year to organize the referendum. So there's other groups that are already in the process of declaring their own state. It's difficult to say exactly how that would play out. But I think that one thing is very clear is that the kind of proliferation of states in this region has the potential to be highly negative when resource distribution is attached to those particular states. So you can have different ethnic states, and I think that it's possible for that to work out in positive ways in terms of empowering the groups that live within those states. The problem is when the resources within those states are only distributed on the basis of ethnicity. So let me give an example that comes specifically from Awassa. So Awassa has been in the news the past few years because it also hosts the largest industrial park, not only in Ethiopia, but in Africa, the Awassa Industrial Park. It potentially is a source of 60,000 jobs. Debatable how valuable these jobs are since they only pay $1 a day, which is also one of the problems that is aggravating the youth movements, but they are still jobs. Now, this is not something that I believe is mandated by the Constitution, but all of the recruitment for those jobs at the industrial park currently takes place within the southern nations and nationalities and peoples region. Awassa is just right on the border with Oromia. There's no reason why they couldn't recruit workers from the Oroma region to work in that industrial park. So this becomes a case where economic resources in the form of jobs is concentrated within the particular regional state, not for constitutional reasons, but as sort of a favoritism for the people that live in that region. So what would happen if Sidama becomes its own state? Does that mean that all 60,000 potential jobs in that industrial park are only given to the Sidama people? Even though it's a diverse group of people living in that area? If so, that's going to create extreme conflict. That's just one example. You could spin that off into a number of other areas, whether it's access to jobs at the university, access to infrastructure, things like that. And so I believe that when ethnic federalism is compounded with this type of ethnic-based resource distribution, that then it is particularly contentious and has the potential to create a much higher degree of conflict, has a much higher potential to create a much higher degree of instability. But it doesn't have to work that way. You can have a Sidama state and still allow people from outside that state to work at the industrial park, for instance. Same with the Awassa University that's based at Awassa.
Or indeed any other
enterprise. Exactly. So I think it really comes, I think that, that's one of the ways where the negative potentials of ethnic federalism occurs is when it gets attached to redistribution, but that's not something that has to happen. Right. There can be ways around that, ways of intervening. That's not the way that ethnic federalism has to occur. It does seem to be increasingly going that direction, I would say, within the past 10 to 15 years, focused more on a tool that allows local politicians to then redistribute resources within their own ethnic group to kind of build up their base. Maybe another form of kind of patron-client relationship that has emerged, but that's not a necessary aspect of ethnic federalism. I guess if we're thinking about ethnic federalism in terms of the way it works in practice versus the way it works in theory, it doesn't have to be that way, but that is the way it's become increasingly in practice, and that's one of the reasons for tensions. And it's also around land. A lot of the recent violence within Awassa has been people pushing, for example, the Walaita people, who are one of the largest groups in Awassa, attacked, pushed off their land. So access to land is another key area there as well.
And there's an interesting counterpoint because, of course, historically, public sector employment drew people from other parts of Ethiopia to places like Awassa. Exactly. Let's take some questions from the floor before coming back to you for final remarks. For the benefit of our online audience, we'd like you to use the microphone, which Amy is about to hand out. We can hear you, but we need to make sure our viewers can also hear you. So please tell us who you are and ask a question. No questions? Someone must have a question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Herman Cohen, former State Department official. The word oppressor was mentioned at the beginning. Now, historically, you had an authoritarian regime under the empire and then under the Derg. Was the power concentrated in a particular ethnic elite, would you say?
Okay, thanks. We'll take a couple before turning back to the panel, if there are other questions. Is that a hand, Mike? No? Okay. All right. Alamayo, let me ask you to respond to that question first.
I think I have to be very theoretical here. Three big people I want to bring into the...
That's not theoretical, that's real.
Hegel, Nietzsche, and John Rawls.
Okay.
Nietzsche, most important, is the one who discovered the historical sense. And, you know, Nietzsche has this book called Untimely Meditations, and the second essay in that collection of essays is called The Use and Disadvantage of History for Life. So, like I was saying earlier, ethnic federalism was prompted by reasons of history, as also by reasons of TI. That reason of history is that narrative of oppression of the nation's nationalities and what the Constitution calls the nation's nationalities and peoples by a certain hegemonic ethnic group. Now, the thing is, one of the defects of the Constitution which needs to be remedied is this excess of historicism.
Yeah.
This excess of, you know, history has a blessing and a curse, and historical knowledge as well. So it's time to shift gear. And, you know, and for the hulls of the body politic called Ethiopia, to move away from this excess historicism of oppression. So I don't want to put my finger on any ethnic group.
Okay. I don't think the question is limited to ethnic groups, but Johannes, how would you respond to this question of the oppressor? The state can also be an oppressor.
I think it's a very important question. Really, you know, we should not ignore, you know, such questions. I agree with Alamayo that history has its blessings, and it could be a curse sometimes. But history is different, you know, in the eyes of everyone, and how we research it, and the methodology, and who writes it. The victor, right? Those who lost. You know, it depends. Earlier, Alamayo mentioned a very interesting example, which I highly appreciated. It was about Emperor Johannes, my namesake. Emperor Johannes IV. So he was the one he's from Tigray, but he died fighting to liberate some parts of Gondar from the Dervish, the Iran's Islamic radicals from the Sudan. And he was also the one who came after Emperor Theodorus, and who, you know, who decided to make Amharic the state language, not because he doesn't like Tigrinya, but because it is conducive to his nation building or state building project. But when it comes to how we actually criticize Emperor Menelik for making that language, we just make it all about Menelik, and we forget all our previous statesmen that we had. Mr. Cohen, I understand that you had, you know, as an Africanist or as someone working for the State Department, in charge of so many important responsibilities, you have played your role in conflict resolution or state building in so many different countries. But I think there is this one major issue that I have also followed some of your remarks about recent political developments in Ethiopia. I think there is something that you actually got completely wrong. Ethiopian history of, especially in contemporary times, is about political narratives. It's not about events or objective reality, but it's embedded on very much subjective, very much political narratives that pit one group against the other. If Mengistu Haile Mariam was half Oromo, or more Oromo, even based on some documents from American government documents, than an Amora. Haile Selassie had, of course, some Oromo lineage as well, right? And I am someone from Gondar, and people may think that, okay, he's an Amara, so he's being defensive on this or that. But, the reality is I do not know a name of a highest official from Gondar who served in the Derg regime or in the Haile Selassie regime. In fact, the empire was authoritarian. Yes, I agree. The Derg, you said it correct. Yes, was authoritarian. But what about EPRDF? Probably the most authoritarian in modern times in our history, and pretty much maybe anti-Ethiopian. But today, somehow, because the so-called unity camp in Ethiopia, those groups who actually advocate for Ethiopian unity, because they are more or less irrelevant because of the rise of ethno-nationalism, EPRDF suddenly looks like the moderate, the center, the choice. They have become an option. If you asked anyone in around 2005 or after the advent of this the 21st century, you would say EPRDF is like no option, but now it's an option. In part, of course, hugely thanks to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's popularity and that this understanding that he wants to do good, right? Although we see him that he is now a hostage of his own political party and the growing strengths of Oromo nationalism, and which he had to rely if he wants to make sure that he wants to survive politically. One thing that also I would like to add is that Amara nationalism is not about going back to the past. If it's say going back to the past, actually it will be the most disastrous to the Amhara, because the past was not good to the Amhara, to be frank. But it is about the future. It's about preventing a systematic oppression that targeted the Amhara, especially after 1991. As I said, this ethnic federal arrangement, if it's about federalism, if it is about bringing government closer to the people, right, empowering groups, expanding these democratic principles and bestowing group rights, individual rights to everyone, that would be great. But as I said, it just came because they wanted, some people or some group wanted to reward some and punish others. And that is, and just one last point. Briefly, okay. Let me just do, yes, nationalism in and of itself just is bad. Whether you call it Amhara nationalism or Oromo nationalism or whichever ethnic group's nationalism in the Ethiopian politics, or Ethiopian nationalism. Nationalism is bad. But in Ethiopia, not only because we do not understand what nationalism is all about, but we do not understand also our politics really well. And our politics is really, really bad. And it is EPRDF's politics. And EPRDF happened to be a group made of the ethno-nationalist political parts itself. So, yeah.
Okay. So before we conclude, I want to put the bottom line question to all of you, which is, we can debate how well ethnic federalism has been implemented, or whether it's defective in design, or whether it's defective in implementation, or a combination thereof. But it is the constitutional disposition of the country today, and that's how it remains.
Yeah.
Is ethnic federalism a viable solution in the long term for Ethiopia, beyond the immediacy of what's happening today or what happened last week? As a sustainable model of governance, it has been the basis there of the Constitution for the last 25 years or so. Is it something that will be able to carry the country forward? Alamayo.
Unfortunately, to our dismay, yes, it is.
Why?
Okay.
Briefly, why?
Okay. Two things. Because I just want to prevent people from misunderstanding me. I'm all for liberal democracy. There is no other option. And Fukuyama is right in his end of history argument, which is Hegelian. It's a Hegelian point. That's not Fukuyama, actually. But ethnic federalism, whatever you call other political arrangements, are arrangements that you craft to deal with the unfavorable conditions of your history. Countries burdened with that kind of history will need to craft such kind of arrangements, federative arrangements, to carry you through to the future. But the future is liberal democracy.
Okay. Daniel, ethnic federalism remains, as we've just heard, as you know. Are there ways in which its approach or its modification might overcome some of the challenges that have been identified, particularly in the southern region, if you want to confine yourself to that, but feel free if you have a national perspective as well.
No, I mean, I think federalism is definitely a viable model. It can work, in terms of its efficacy. I don't know if there's a better model out there for governing the country, but there's a couple things. One I already touched on is when ethnic federalism is directly linked with distribution of resources, that undermines the system. Right. The second, which I haven't had a chance to talk about very much, is this issue of youth, particularly youth as a powerful force that's of political movements that are based in youth. So, youth unemployment in Ethiopia, urban youth unemployment has historically, when I was doing research in the early 2000s on the topic, was around 50%. And when I'm talking about youth as well, we're talking about ages like 18 to 40, for instance. You can be 38 years old and still live with your parents and still be classified as a youth. This is a very volatile population. And when you have a population like this that is desperate for accessing an income, to build a family, to achieve these goals of becoming an adult, the term fendata is sometimes used in Amharic, literally translates as explosive. So when you have that makes it very difficult to have discussions about statehood when there's a large population of youth that are desperate for economic change and willing to advocate for that in ways that are sometimes violent and to grab those resources. So you can have a much more, I think, relaxed, less tense conversation about ethnic federalism, about the rights of states, when that population of youth in some ways is not so militant. How do you get to that? Part of that is through the creation of jobs. I mean, the jobs that were created through infrastructural development, as well as the massive expansion of the university system in Ethiopia during the past 15 years, was a small step towards alleviating some of that explosive tension. The jobs at the Awassa Industrial Park do the opposite, because you're paying people $1 a day, which is not enough to live in the context of a vibrant city like Awassa. It creates another point of stress, another point of friction. So to the degree to which you can offer economic development where youth are not seeing their own ethnicity as their only approach to getting ahead and improving their lives, that changes the discussions around ethnic federalism, and it allows those discussions to kind of take that violent threat out of the discussion and gives more time, more patience. This is not, to have a new state at the same time that Prime Minister Abiy has just come into power, dealing with all these other things, assassinations, deaths in his own family, a huge number of things. It's a lot to handle in a short amount of time. Then to have sort of a militant youth group also demanding state rights, it's a lot to deal with at once. The degree to which you can slow that down depends on being able to offer people economic development. Of course, that's not going to happen overnight. You can't expect patience from people that are living just day to day, hand to mouth, but I think that's one of the ways of making ethnic federalism viable is through economic development more generally.
Dr. Johannes Guillaume, last word to you, briefly speaking. If ethnic federalism is here to stay, are there things, it's easy to point out the defects or the limitations. It's easy to point out what hasn't been done well over the last 25 years, but also today. We can easily do that. Are there things that can be done to improve the situation? Are there things that can be done? We've heard some ideas from Daniel Maines just now. Are there other things that could be done to either make the system more equal, or more fair, more equitable for all of Ethiopia's people?
Sure. I corroborate to what Daniel said, but also I would say that in today's Ethiopian politics, it's very, very difficult to not see federalism as the only alternative. But federalism is good because just federalism is going to work, and it works everywhere. But ethnic federalism is not good. I think we should not undermine, or we should not discount this idea of group rights, right?
Yeah, but what to do about them? I mean, they're there, right? This is the question.
Yeah, I think we need to have a more consolidated regions. In terms of, we have to redesign regions a bit. We have to make regions more heterogeneous instead of just which comes against this homogenization project. If we are actually to coexist and live together. Besides, today I don't see any group that advocates a return to a unitary government structure. Not that unitary governments are bad. No, they are not. I mean, most of the countries in the world are unitary states. It's just that even in unitary states, power can be distributed heavily, and we can have decentralization. But today, I think, just like Daniel said, we just have to make sure that we differentiate between physical federalism and what this federal arrangement in Ethiopia is designed to accomplish, because everything else is not really working. And if we are to promote democracy, right, and if democracy is going to grow and that country becomes a democratic state, I think we will also be able to have the answers for most of our problems, because federalism is not the answer, democracy is. And federalism then, as a democratic compromise, could help us achieve better governments at the central level or local government levels.
Please join me in thanking Daniel Maines, Johannes Guillaume, and Alemayo Fantal Weather-Mariam for their remarks today. Thanks. And thank you to all of you for coming.
It was such a great discussion.